You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
The Lunar New Year is coming up, and I always look forward to lots of family time centered around food. You may know this already, but Chinese people love their food-related homonyms. So, fish, yu, and yu, which signifies prosperity and abundance. And there's steamed pudding or lin gou, which kind of sounds like lin gou, and it means something like improving every year. Sweet rice dumplings, tong yun, which doesn't just apply to Chinese New Year, but we love it around any big holiday. Tong yun sounds almost the same as tun yun. Harmony, wholesomeness, bringing the whole family together. And another auspicious dish around this time of year is braised dried oyster with black moss, or fa chai hou si. I met with Chef Edwin Tang. He's the Chinese executive chef at Mira Hotel's Cuisine, and he said every ingredient in this dish is symbolic of bringing good luck.
Black hair moss sounds like wealthiness. Dried oysters means good fortune. Mushroom and garlic symbolize gold and wealth, and pea shoots represent jade. Chinese people create this dish especially for the Lunar New Year.
The dish is traditionally made with hou si, or dried oysters, but Chef Edwin opted to use gum hou instead. That's golden oysters.
The traditional dried oysters are usually smaller, and their taste can be quite overwhelming. Meanwhile, golden oysters are larger and have a bittersweet and milder taste, so it's more common now to use golden oysters for this dish.
Chef Edwin prepared two other dishes made with golden oysters. The first one was a honey-glazed golden oyster.
This is a honey-glazed golden oyster. We first lightly wash the oyster and steam it with spring onions and ginger to get rid of the fishy smell. Then we pan-fry it until it gets slightly charred. Then we brush it with honey, just like barbecuing, and we put it on top of a rice crisp for easy holding and texture, so it has a combination of softness and crunchiness.
Chef Edwin also made a spin-off of the Cantonese classics fortune chicken and crispy chicken by combining the two with golden oyster.
To make the flavor more distinct, not only do I marinate the chicken, but I also mix the meat with a golden oyster gravy, so every part of the dish is well balanced.
So the skin is golden and crispy, like one of our favorite dishes, crispy chicken. But inside is stuffed with ingredients that you usually find in a fortune chicken, which is the one that's usually wrapped around clay. And inside you find a chicken that's stuffed with a lot of goodies, such as like roast pork or dried scallops. But this time he's cut up bits of golden oyster just to enhance that umami flavor, topped with the crispy skin of the crispy chicken. It was so nice. When you think of oysters, you probably imagine them as raw or fully cooked. But golden oysters are half-dried, a delicacy unique to Hong Kong. They're neither fully raw nor fully dried, but they're totally safe to eat.
Purveyors use knowledge handed down over many centuries to make these oysters. The salinity, humidity, temperature, and the length of time it takes to dry them help keep bacteria at safe levels. They are perfectly safe to eat.
Well, I would say golden oysters is just straddling the line between dried oysters and a fresh oyster. It still has a little bit of a dried outside, so it keeps together, it doesn't fall apart, it doesn't flop anywhere. That's why you could still pan fry and cook with it. However, it still retains a lot of the brininess of the sea. So the flavor has that similar kind of enhanced flavor of oysters, but a lot more of the chewiness and I would just say a really nice pillowy bite to it. So I would say that golden oysters are a very nice balance of the two. But Chef Edwin said prices have increased year after year because only a handful of people still make them.
The only place that is still making them is Lau Fau Shan.
We just exited the Western Tunnel and we're on the big freeway into the new territories. We're on our way to Lau Fau Shan, which apparently is just like on the border of Shenzhen and Hong Kong, which is where they make all the dried seafood in Hong Kong, or what's left anyway.
In 300 meters, slide left onto Tin Yu Road.
It's a lot of shrubbery here.
Your destination is on the left.
And we have arrived. It's kind of like a small industrial building, corrugated iron, 2 stories. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited, we're here. Ooh, the outside wall is put together by oyster shells. That's really cool. Right after arriving, I met up with Chef Lau Fau Shan. He is the chef and owner of a private kitchen called Caddy and Teal, but he also makes a lot of products such as prepackaged soups, dried products such as little rice crackers or deep-fried walnuts. That is a very popular appetizer when you sit around waiting for your relatives to arrive at the Chinese restaurant. So Chef Lau also really likes using products from Lau Fau Shan. So he introduced us to an oyster farmer in that area. So, Chef Charles, tell me about Lau Fau Shan and why are we here?
Lau Fau Shan is one of the best places for seafood in Hong Kong for so many years, and we are here today for Chan Chang Gei, one of the best brands especially for the gold oyster.
But is there something about this area that makes it good for drying oysters?
The first thing is about the water that's so rich in minerals because it's among the sea and also the river from the inner bank of China. And so the oyster or the crab and also everything here is so rich in nutrient. And second, the flavor is good. And lastly, the people here get the space, they can sun-dry it without so many interference.
And Chef Charles brought me to Chang Chang Key.
And here comes with all the oyster in all the trays. They are under the sun, getting ready for the best timing.
When we arrived at Chang Chang Key, there really isn't much of a sign that it is a farm apart from this wall that is lined with oyster shells. But when you walk in and you go into the immediate back area, it opens up to the beach. And lined in trays and trays and trays are different sizes of oysters in different stages of being dried. Some of them are quite fresh, some of them have been out for days. And it smelled a little fishy. There's so many oyster shells just strewn along the little port that they have. And the pier is just covered with oyster shells. When we got there, it was actually low tide. So it looked kind of scenic in a way where the boats are just languishing on the shoreline, no water taking it anywhere. And the owners actually have a few dogs that roam around and maybe a couple of cats too. So what makes a good one, a good golden oyster?
First, we can smell it. Mm-hmm. The smell is really sweet, full of the smell of the oyster. And the second you will see is a really fat one like me. Get the tummy here.
Right.
And you can see here is the roll inside.
Right, you can see oyster roll inside.
Yeah. So you can imagine when you bite on it, you can have the texture.
Very soft but a little bit chewy at the same time.
You can find out that the inward of it is still moist. The outside of it is dried it a little bit. Mm-hmm. So once we pan fry it or cook it, it will be a little bit crispy for the texture. But it's really hard to get this ideal taste because sometimes the weather is hard to maintain. Maybe the first 2 days are really dry, but suddenly it gets some rain or get the monsoon wind and it become soft.
So it's a very delicate balance.
Yeah, so it's all about luck and technique.
That's amazing. Chef Charles then went off to the kitchen to prepare a few dishes. In the meantime, I was introduced to Mrs. Chan, or affectionately known as Chang Sou. Chang Sou, 你好啊！
你好。
哇，啲蠔好靚喎！
超好食啊！
She's the owner of Chan Chang Key and has been working on the oyster farm since she was 8 years old. As we stood on the little beach of her farm, we were overlooking this huge skyline of Shenzhen. And she pointed it out to me that before the British lease of Hong Kong, That whole shoreline belonged to her great-grandfather, or the people of the Shajing village.
嗱，前邊嗰啲樓咧都係蠔田，係我哋沙井嘅。咁大陸咧，而家一30年就收埋啫嘛。
Shajing is now number 11 on the metro line in Shenzhen.
下一站沙井，沙井。
There is still a village town there. She told me that they have a little town hall with a columbarium full of their ancestors, but I somehow can't help but feel that it is a shadow of its prior glory.
阿老豆啊、阿爺啊嗰隊咧都係兩邊間做嘅。
哦，
梗啊！
以前望落去唔係咁噶咯喎，
以前望落去嗰度咪係好似呢邊嘅咯，好似呢邊個蠔灘咯。
The views on the oyster farm are spectacular, but to be able to produce plump, delicious oysters takes a lot of hard work.
而家唔使嘅，而家唔使咁辛苦嘅。以前咧要潛水。
Growing up, Cheng So would dive into the water to harvest oysters, regardless of the weather.
有，我陀咗個女8個月，我都係跟佢潛水啊。
Cheng So also said that she was diving even when she was 8 months pregnant with her daughter.
好辛苦㗎，我哋捱一兩餐好辛苦㗎。你而家叫我潛水就冇啦，就係啊老啦，年紀大啦。
Cheng So also had her fair share of injuries and scars. She actually rolled up her pants to show us one scar on her knee.
有見證㗎嗱，真係唔怕失禮啊嗱。
That she got when she was diving for oysters, and one of the shells just cut right through to the knee, and she said you could see bone and she just couldn't stop bleeding.
一引泥板一撞就係咁啦。
So she just shucked a nearby oyster, placed it on top of the wound, covered it with some mud to stop the bleeding, and continued to work. She basically used the oyster as a band-aid.
膠布都冇㗎，一隻手都放落去㗎。哇！我哋周身刀啊，周身傷㗎。
真係辛苦錢啊！呢啲
係啊，講少㗎，呢啲啊灰毫啊。
I think for Cheng So to show us a scar that she had since she was a girl and it was still so prominent, I could just imagine the frenzy, the importance of harvesting time to a farmer's family. That all hands on deck, there is no rest to be had, and everybody just needs to just power through. Now, new farming techniques means Cheng So doesn't need to dive into cold waters anymore. But as Chef Charles said earlier, making oysters require a lot of luck and technique because oysters are very dependent on the weather. For example, when they're spawning in the water, the optimal water temperature can't be warmer than 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And they usually spawn for 4 to 5 months before they're harvested. But with climate change and Hong Kong's weather getting hotter and more humid, Cheng So has had to delay her harvest a bit more each year.
以前咧就過咗重陽霜降咧就收過，而家咧褪下褪到農曆初10。咁多年嚟最遲今年個收過。初9先。
Well, it's really cool to know that Cheng So still farms her oysters according to the 24 solar terms, which is how they separate the times of the year in the Chinese almanac. Now, we usually think of that as a lot of like fortune-telling mumbo-jumbo, and it's so interesting how it still applies to farmers that were taught how to farm the Chinese way and how they've been noticing the changes in the characteristics of these 24 solar terms because of climate change.
今年分遲咗好多啦，因為天氣唔夠凍，一年比一年嗰個回暖程度。
After harvesting, the oysters are then dried. Others in the industry would dry their oysters over fire, but Cheng So insists on the old school way. That's by sun drying. Under good conditions, again, that's dry and cold weather, it only takes 2 days to sun-dry golden oysters.
更好咧就曬2日。2日如果你北風，
But if the weather is a bit more humid, it could take up to 2.5 days.
咧就要2日泵。
The water condition has also got to be just right.
我哋扣嗰個東江水落嚟咧
Chef Charles mentioned this briefly, but the reason why the oyster industry has flourished in Lau Fau Shan is because the area is in a tiny pocket at the Pearl River estuary, where fresh water from the river mixes with seawater. This creates brackish water, or ham tam so in Cantonese, which is an ideal environment for oysters to grow. Unfortunately, sometimes the water gets too salty, and Mrs. Chan was left with a batch of dead oysters last year. Chun So wasn't very specific in what exactly happened. All she knew was that the warmer weather and the currents didn't behave like it usually did from the time before. And while some environmentalists would argue that because of the reshaping of the Shenzhen shoreline, that would definitely affect how the currents are running into Shenzhen River and affect the salinity of the water. But none of this has discouraged Chun So at all. She says sometimes she gets to feed her family well, and sometimes she'll just have to do with a little less. It takes a lot of grit to be able to persevere for so many years, though. She's been in this industry for basically her entire life, ever since she was 8 years old, and now she's about to turn 75. Even her husband has asked her to take a rest, but she just can't resist visiting her oyster farm and checking how her oysters are doing. She really loves what she does. I also feel Chun So feels that she is one of the last stalwarts of this tradition of farming oysters in that particular part of Hong Kong.
I'm walking out on the pier here and it's just covered in oyster shells. There's a strong fishy flavor in the air. Mrs. Chan told me that they use some of these shells again for next year's harvest. Mrs. Chan's house is a 2-story building of corrugated iron. You wouldn't spot a house like this anywhere within the city limits. But it looks like she's got all her creature comforts. There's an air conditioning unit, there's an antenna for television. It looks like she lives a very comfortable and simple life out here.
When it comes to eating golden oysters, Chun So said one of her favorite dishes ever since she was a girl was pan-frying the smaller oysters with homemade oyster sauce and then serving it with fried rice. For the larger oysters, she would simply pan-fry and dip it in sugar. But Chef Charles was cooking something special for us.
Chef Charles, what are you making?
Lisa, I'm making one of my secret recipe. That's the golden oyster san choy bao.
Oh wow, I've never had that before.
Yeah, you need to have it today with the best golden oyster from our best friend, Mrs. Chen.
He pan-fried the golden oysters until they were crispy.
Crispiness.
Then he paired them with cured Shanghai ham.
So are you going to cook the Shanghai ham?
Yes. After I turn over the oyster, I will put the ham inside.
When that was all golden fried and done cooking, he served it on top of lettuce leaves.
And at the end, we'll put a little bit honey on it. Wow, 見到都覺得好食。長手開飯啦。
The lettuce makes for easy holding, but the Shanghai ham with its umami and sweetness just brings out the underlying ocean flavors in the middle. It's so delicious.
Cheers. Cheers.
I think the new year means something a little different to each culture. In Western culture, it's about resolutions, trying to do better for the next year. To the Chinese, it's all about everything good, everything great. You're not even allowed to talk about bad things around Chinese New Year. This episode about golden oysters, we talked about a lesser-known Chinese New Year dish. that also coincidentally is going through a little bit of a threat. I think I want everyone to think about and celebrate this dish, at the same time fall in love with it. And maybe we could make the resolution to try and save it a little bit. On this note, I wish everybody a happy Lunar New Year. 新年快樂，恭喜發財，身體健康，萬事如意，發財好事。